in a way, it's a little bit complicated, again, to speak about a performance that the audience hasn't seen. Well, yeah, I've seen it, but most people here have not, and some are going to. But still, first of all, what I would suggest is maybe, Björn, if you want to respond to some of the things we've said, if there's something that it sparks in you, but then also, it's really okay to ask questions, regardless of whether you know what's going on or not. So, but I'll first turn it over to you.
There were so many interesting things I would want to, but I just thought maybe to specify the me and the we that you commented on, right? So, and this is kind of a clear choice that I've done. Like when I speak about my choreographic practice in general, I talk about me, but when I speak about specific productions, I talk about we, because it is very much, and it's specifically with Prologue, a work that was made together and with Sophie. And the choreography is also, of course, made by her, both in terms of the process that we had together, but also during each night, because it's not either a strictly set choreography. She has a lot of agency and a lot of possibilities to morph and alter the specific choreography. I should also say that in many of mine choreographies, but also in Prologue specifically, we have scores that are concerning the reactions from the audience. There are also tasks inscribed in the choreography that says how and when she should react on the people in the audience. And these scores and instructions are different in different parts of the performance. There's also sometimes where she shall not, or we have decided that she should not, no matter what happens. So it's also not a constant thing, but it's also part of the dramaturgical argument within the performance. So that's I wanted to say for sure. And also I should say, in relationship to that Sophie is not here, she was invited, but then we agreed, and she was part of that decision making, that we preferred having the conversation so close to the performance so that maybe some people could come, because she was interested of having also you in the audience. So that was also a shared decision, just to. No, but it's true, and I would say like in general within contemporary choreography and practices, dancers are authors of the work that they do. Not only the specific movements that specific dancer is doing, but the whole piece. That's for sure. And then there were so many interesting subjects. I wonder, is there one that we should go in specifically to? Which one to choose?
Can I ask you something?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
When you talk about your work, it sounds very much research-based. And also you told us about this, what was it, a VR project?
Yes.
You did together with Per Nilsson, the philosopher. So I'm just curious, what is your relation to research, artistic research? Do you consider your work as artistic research, or what is the relation with research?
Right. I think I have, and as I maybe said a bit in the because I do not have, let's say, a proper academic education, I sometimes personally feel like, I don't know if I can say that I'm an academic. But I did this VR project and I've done a lot of things in the academy, and I'm teaching on MA level and So I think because of that, sometimes I'm like, is it really research? Am I allowed to call my work research? So that's a whole power system that I are juggling with as an art, because I'm very much more an independent artist that sometimes walks in and out of academia. But I would say in relationship to my inspiration, let's say, or where I take my knowledge, it very much comes from philosophy, language philosophy and post-structuralist theory. I'm just starting with psychoanalysis. I'm not so far into that yet. But I mean, those are somehow like, I even have, like whenever I feel that I dried out, or like feel like, how should I proceed? There's this professor, Paul Fry, that teaches linguistics, that you can see is like open seminars. That's my first to-go place when I need. So there's like seminars on linguistics from the 1900s until today. So that's where I go. So in that sense, yes, I feel
And your dialogue with Per, how did that start?
Yeah, it started actually, we were in a similar context like this, in a seminar together, and had lunch afterwards and clicked. And then we started to work together for 1.5 years, and I came to lecture. He was teaching then aesthetics at the university in Umeå, and I came to give some lectures there, and then meanwhile we were writing this VR application. And when we were working, very often, because I travel so much, he kind of tagged along, traveling around in Europe and a bit in the States. And he was with us in the studio. And I would say that Per really emphasizes dialogue as the basic method for philosophical work. So that's basically how we worked during all these years, talking. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, can I connect to you?
Absolutely. Can I just say one thing? This is completely sort of out of order in what we were going to do, but because I was a little bit like scattered when we started, I forgot something really important that I told the two of you that we were going to do, which was allow everyone in the space to just say their name and who they are so that we all know who we're talking to. And instead I just sort of jumped into it. And most people know each other, but not everyone. So yes, Erling, but will you also just say who you are and do a quick round so that, I mean, since you're new to the context, for example, and maybe someone else is too, you know who's talking? Is that okay?
We're just, Erling Björn, I'm a PARSE professor also. Work with Kristina.
I'm Taka. I'm an exchange student from Japan. Actually, I'm studying English at other faculty. I used to play musical theater in Japan, so I'm very interested in this dialogue, so I came here.
Wow.
Henrik Andersson. I'm my English title is always I'm the director of studies. Thank you, of the master program here at the Academy of Music and Drama.
And I'm also in the same department. Professor in scenisk gestalting. I prefer to say it in Swedish because it's always complicated with the translation of scenisk gestalting into English. And I'm also a director working mainly with physical theatre.
My name is Malin Lindroth, and I am an author and a playwright. And like you do, I sometimes walk in and out and do some lectures and research projects. But I'm mainly an artist, writer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Anders Lundqvist. I'm a professor of composition at the Academy of Music and Drama.
Okay, my name is Eva Ingmarsson and I'm a choreographer and artistic director at Atalante. Then you?
And my name is Merja Kakko. I'm a musician, a guitar player, and I try to also compose music.
And the camera woman?
Yes, do you want to introduce yourself also?
My name is Natalie and I'm a freelance photographer. So that's why I'm here.
Happy to document all our dialogues to save and to publish. But Erling, yeah, you wanted to ask a question, I think.
Yeah, I haven't unfortunately seen your work, but when you were talking about these very kind of basic things like how movement are constructed, and you talked about syntax and which are linguistic terms, and then when Kristina was talking, it was a lot about citation, and for me citation are very culturally specific practices, while a certain branch of linguistics at least is very universalistic. So I was wondering, there are obviously different schools within linguistics, but they will be looking at the essential meaning of a specific word, and they will say it has a universal meaning across any culture and so forth. So I'm wondering, like, where do you position yourself? Then I also have another question in relation to the audience, but I don't. Should I take both at the same time?
Yeah, why not?
If I understood you right, you seem to, maybe I'm misunderstanding you, that the audience somehow needs to be activated, and that the dancers know something and the audience doesn't know something. So I'm wondering if, is it so that they are not active, or that are not taking responsibility for active kind of reinterpretation? This is a question that, for example, Rancière raises critically, that the emancipated spectator, so which is a power relation, and the basic idea of the relationship between the artist and other people, you could say. So if you could comment on those two things.
Wow, okay. So the first question is about linguistics and quotation.
Well, I'm thinking specifically, what do you mean when you say movements? How specific are they, or how, are they dance movements, which is like a language that is its own language, or is it a language that is culturally kind of grounded in specific contexts, or how universal are they? All these things.
Yeah, I'm not sure how universal they are, and it differs, I would say. Also, within this specific work, I would say there are certain things that are very specifically contextualized. Like, for example, this text part is very much a Swedish reference, without spoiling too much. Then there are, of course, not only, but I mean, it's taken from a very, in terms of what it's quoting, it's taken from a YouTube clip that is very specifically Swedish, done in Swedish and so on. The text is Swedish and so forth. But of course, we hope that, I would say that at least within a Western world, it is very much also recognizable as a specific type of woman or representation of a woman. In the beginning, no?
This is the best teaser ever.
But I mean, no, because it is. But what's interesting is that when I talk about that we want to work with, or always, very often I start with this: what is it that is possible to identify or understand as an audience? I would say in terms of touring, because I am only touring in Europe and North America so far. So I couldn't say, because I never tried it, how exactly certain of these things would be. And I think anyhow, that look would then be on a Western, perhaps, language at some parts of the performance. Right? So it's hard, but certain things are quite universal. It's difficult to...
Could I just add?
Sure. Can I just, like, if you do this movement, I mean, if you're in a baseball field, or if you're in Palestine, and you have some Israelis who have occupied you, like, in Arcadia Salles, and you're doing this movement, is it the same movement?
I would say also, like, I would say that in a way you could never consider a movement being just a singular event. Movements are, as specific words, for example, always in the context of a sentence or something, so that I would say that the same, or almost the same at least, physical movement that could be, let's say, pulled out will have the possibility of signifying a lot of different things depending on the movement before and after. Or how the contract is established with the interpreter, or how. So, no, I mean, it's a very complex system there, but So I think, like, if you want to have that movement really signifying baseball, if you do another movement before or after, even in Palestine, you would then be able to signify baseball, right? No, I mean, it's very tricky.
And it's gender. Can I ask you if perhaps you mean also, is your question also, is this a dancing movement or is it a functional movement? I mean, it's also the intention of the movement, and you can have different intention with almost the same movement, and it express really different things.
Well, I'm trying to just locate. I'm
Yeah.
not questioning actually. I'm just trying to locate where you position yourself and to what degree the line between. I understand performance or dance as a specific language, but it's also always kind of a movement into what is happening in society. Like that's the question of citation. So it's this question of purification and citation. It's like
I would say that
how do you position yourself in that kind of.
In terms of the citations that we work with in Prologue, we are citating dance movements a lot, but we also citate all types of gestures. If we would make a difference in between a dance movement and a gesture. A dance movement is also a gesture that conveys meaning of a certain type. We are, if you have a dance background, then you could see clear quotations that would come from, let's say, a very clear realm of dance language. But the choreography is made up as much of the choreographies that we are doing at the moment. I don't consider there's any difference in that, or that one thing is more or less dance. I would rather say that maybe certain movements more often are within one context or the other. But
Could I just add to that? Because I think, what Eva is bringing up is hugely important, because what I experience then is that the intention shifts. So it will be one thing, like throwing like a man, and then it will the next time shift. So it morphs into something. So you will never get the one thing. You will have several versions of it, and then you end up in something completely different. And I think if you come from a different culture, I'm looking at you now, to take the example of the section where the dancer speaks and she says, "Thank you." And that can be said in many ways, but then it's choreographed, so it's thank you, and then it shifts. So it's a great many versions, choreographed versions, embodied versions of the thank you. So I would assume that depending on where you come from, you would grasp something of that, and you could relate it to something that makes sense for you. So I think it's kind of broad, and also today with the digital media, we're kind of globalized in a way as well. Okay, so just wanted to add on to that.
I also want to add something. I'm trying to make sense, because what you're asking about is also sort of like the relationship between a gesture to universalize and the specific, right? And it can also, like the way you're talking about syntax as in linguistics as an attempt to systematize, so that we can break language down into small components that can be then systematically used without this sort of inflection or whatever it is, right? And then the idea of citation as always referring to something specific. But it seems to me that, to me also what's so, what I like so much about watching this performance is that it's kind of doing both of those things at once. Because by breaking gesture down into its smallest components that could be like, the phoneme or whatever we want to call it in linguistics, and then sort of remodeling how those things are put together, this whole sort of world of significance happens, because it's not just a word, it's actually a full gesture, it's done in a relationship, it's done in space, it's done in time, sometimes it's done to music, and that all these signifying things come in and affect how we understand each moment. Yeah. So when you were mentioning the hair thing, where she's like constantly throwing her hair back, a little bit, just depending on the look in her eye, it either looks like a mad woman doing something compulsive, or it looks like one of those commercials for shampoo, right? Or it could be like a sports gesture, but it's not the hand, or necessarily even the intensity of the movement. It's maybe where the eye is looking. Right, so it's like those little things can alter the whole meaning of it. So those building blocks are both sort of shown, I think, to be objective in a sense, because we can see them as technique, and at the same time we can't disassociate it from specificity and meaning. So there's that doubleness. But you had one more question also, and then Anders wants to ask something.
I don't want to
No, this is the point.
It was the audience question.
Well, the audience
But I
question,
think
right.
also maybe just as one last thing, because a lot of the method, I just want to mention maybe just to try to be a bit more like specific, because you are already saying some good things. Like, so very often what we do in terms of, I'm going to mention we have more methods than two, but like for example we have two methods that we used a lot in this production. One of them is really, let's say, working from quotation. We take a video clip from YouTube that we study for weeks and weeks and weeks, and we make it as exact as we can with every single little eye, exactly the angle of the hand, everything, every movement, the rhythm, like super copy. And then we basically deconstruct it. So like we do it once, exactly as it was on YouTube, and the second time, or like, and then we do it 4 times, and every time the arms moves 1 decimeter higher up. We're not doing exactly like this in the performance. And then it will transform, right? So that we are, and the other thing is that we do, as some of you said, movements that are, let's say, you take one movement that is repeated, and then we just start to alter it. It could be altering it, it could do this because it goes even faster. So like, if it just turns like this, or goes like this, it directly clings in to becomes a different meaning, right? Depending on what it's combined with. And that's like, we call it RT, like repetition by transformation, or transformation by repetition. So there's like, that's exactly like what we are trying to do, both. And the in-betweens and all. Yeah.
So what about the audience? And then we'll
Right.
go to Anders. Do you want to speak to that?
Oh yeah, repeat again. The question was exactly the activation of the audience.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I was hearing some kind of underlying that the dancers and the choreographer, they know something, and then there is. And they are active, and then the audience is kind of passive, and they don't know something. So we need to activate them, and we need to kind of make them more knowledgeable, which is a very classical way of viewing, and it's kind of power relation that is often argued by. And I just wondered.
Yeah, I would say like it's not really that we have a specific thing that we would then like to show them or teach them or anything like that. It's more in terms of wanting to engage them in a way, like to seduce them, so that this machine of interpretation becomes activated, so that they get activated with themselves. Then of course we have a lot of underlying politics that we are believe strongly in, and kind of also are pushing out there. But then of course they can have opinions or disagreements, or but is that an answer? I mean, because I think they are of course already activated. I mean, well, it depends, but I hope not that as an audience when you go somewhere you are already activated by going there, watching specifically this. But then the question is maybe how do we want to play on that activation? And I think, at least for me, it's always really interesting to try to consider what is the specific contract that is established with this audience in what specific time or space, and how can that be transformed or questioned or altered or
It's interesting. I mean, I was in the audience and saw it for the first time, and in the beginning we were sitting there being kind of audience with some agency, and but the roles and the boundaries were pretty clear and pretty traditional. But then, in sort of maybe second section, when the dancer was establishing her world, she also came towards the audience, and I think she touched a few of the audience members, which activates us in a way. Not that we have been necessarily passive, but it shifts our role into something more participatory, I would say. Then, towards the end, she left the building, sort of, and came back. And of course, we were sitting there paying attention to the situation and thinking, shall we applaud? Is it over? Nobody did, because I think the audience is very, I mean, Atalante, people are used to type of performance, so we simply waited. She came back in and she started to doing sort of gestures that, wouldn't you applaud? And we sat there and I started smiling, going like this, but without applauding. And then after the performance, she commented upon that and said, oh, that was a nice interaction or something. So it, as you say, I mean, so many scripts were in there, but
and it was
I think
funny
the
also.
choreographer for us.
For me, it's a question, again, since in relation to research, who knows? And if you ask ethnomethodologists, they would say, for example, in sociology, they would say that we are extreme as whoever, not an artist or a sociologist, we are extremely good at performing everyday actions.
Yeah.
And we are good at deconstructing them also. So it's this question: what do we win in the arts? Because we do, in making this argument, that some people, you are doing the research, you're also finding a lot out when you're doing the YouTube, and you're actually depending on deeply knowledgeable, thinking, critical, active people in the audience who can decipher complex things.
Yeah.
So it's this question of what do we win by kind of configuring this relationship in a certain way? I think that's what Rancière has made me kind of reconsider a lot of things in how I approach this kind of duality between artist and audience. And so,
yeah,
you don't need to answer it. I just because it appears so often. This kind of.
Yeah, I don't know either if I have a clear answer, maybe in that sense. I mean, it's also that is also some part of an ongoing investigation, right? Like, for example, the moment where yesterday was the first time where the audience did not applaud together with her. That has never happened before. So that was extremely interesting for her, right? And a very political choice from the audience, I would say, right? In terms of finding their agency, right? Because and we performed it in many different countries and so forth, and this was the first time, right? So that's also really interesting. What does that say, or both to the audience but also to us, right? I mean, it is a dialogue. I mean, we're hopefully finding something out together. I would hope. Yeah. But,
So Anders, did you want to ask a question also?
Yeah, well, it was really from the other direction, because when you started to talk, I heard you very much as it could have been a composition seminar. You sounded like a composer, explaining how one works with sounds and structures. And so I just got interested in how you mentioned the limbs and joints, and if you could say something about how you think or how you ground your work or movements from that
these angles?
From the really physiological.
Right. It's a big and really interesting question. In terms of methodology, I think, I mean, when I started to research those specific limbs, I came very much from out of Forsyth improvisation, William Forsyth improvisation, and that was kind of the school in how I learned to think about movement analysis.
Will you say something about that, just in case people don't know?
Oh, all right, yes. So he's, let's say, one of the world's biggest, or most famous choreographers within the neoclassical, or he kind of reinvented the neoclassical. He came from Balanchine, and then he's doing a lot of installation work and all sorts of things. But I think he was also really early, one of the choreographers that really early on started to document his methodologies. And he made these DVDs that were handed out. So he was very transparent. This is already early 2000. So a lot of young dancers and choreographers all over the world, like me, had those DVDs and started to practice his methodologies. And it's very broad, his methodology, but it's very much, at least in the beginning of it, specified in how you initiate movements from the joints in relationship to space. Many other things as well, but that was one of the key things that happened for me. So I would say like one of the first things that I for is always, where is the initiation point? Where does the movement start, basically? And then we start to trace then what are the contra movements that happens. And this is very much as well to try to find this movement heritage that I talked about, because there's a lot of, I would say within many dance practices, what you learn to very quickly as a dancer is the preparation movement in a way. Like dance is very much based on the weight shift. I mean, you can do different type of weight shift in ballet or in release technique and da. But for example, how when a dancer is supposed to move the arm, there's already a lot of activation, right? So we look a lot into these activations and we try to kind of decompose or like to deconstruct them and then start to separate them and treat them as separate and start shifting and moving them around. And then, as I would say, I mean, I think many choreographers, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, there's always this strong, like, you look at the movement spatially, like how is the movement trajectory going through space? You look at the rhythm, you look at the tensions or relaxations in specific muscles, and then, of course, also maybe intention or whatever. But I would say these kind of tension, relaxation, spatial coordination or movement, and rhythm and musicality are somehow the three ground analytical tools, and I still use them very much. It's the same thing. We take this YouTube clip and we learn it, and that's where we start to manipulate. Let's try to do exactly that gesture in a different tempo. Or different.
But could you go the other way around? I mean, start with the muscle and the joint?
Yeah, we do that also.
I mean, to make sort of a composition out of the physiological stuff happening and then coming out sort of into the form.
Yeah. And there is a part of the of the piece where we kind of, it's in the end, the absolutely end actually. Sophie's then engaged in a practice that is dealing with a, let's say then, quite abstract instruction, where she's trying to, like, she envisions certain half circle lines in the space, and then she chooses one specific body part and that has to follow this trajectory, and then she's examining each combination of how the joints and the muscle, vad säger man, sena?
Tendon.
How each the extremity of each tendon in sequel relation throughout the body until the trajectory is finished, and then she starts a new one. So that one I would say, for example, but there's others as well. And I think what I'm interested in my choreographies is very often then having a materiality that is maybe, let's say, as theater or coming from a gesture, and then directly starting with that. So there's almost, you could say that the score is very often one material, but then we have a lot of layers of other scores that are saying, for example, we have one practice that is called minimal encounters, which is that every single movement needs to be altered from the original 1 centimeter in direction in space. But otherwise, and it needs to be altered different centimeters and directions every time. Right, so that's a very specific physical, let's say, which extremely demanding. But it's also because we talked a lot about, I mean, we came into what is the actual authentic. And I've been invested in many years, and in Prologue we have several practices that we talk a lot about presence production as the maybe the point where there might be actually something authentic, where she is so present that she's not aware what she produces on a representational level. And many of those methods around presence production are dealing with an overflow of information that would somehow destroy her awareness, and then she's kind of jumping in and out of different types of awareness maybe, and that could then become a presence as a some type of intensity. Why did I go into this? Oh yeah, because of the authentic. That is maybe or a demasking or an actual authentic moment. They might be very short, right? But there's where she is also not able to be on the reflective side of her mind.
Can I just, I was thinking about this piece when she took the mobile phone.
All right,
and
yes.
And that's really interesting. It was words like explosion, drinking coffee, yeah, just single words she was listening on. And for me it was like, it was a kind of inspiration to different moments.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's another, I mean,
way into the work.
Yeah. You can inspire from just wood, or a forest, or a cat, or something, and it can come out a lot of different moments.
Yeah, and we had that as a. I mean, that is a practice that is still part of the piece, and that we worked a lot with in the process, where we were interested of seeing, it's like in charades in a way. Like, why do we do certain movements when we do charades, right? Because they are usually not the realistic movement. They are a symbol of some sort. So we had this like non-narrative, high-speed charade game that we played in the studio, where we had words, we wrote down words in different categories, and then one person was filming, one person was on the floor, and one person was just trying to change category and screaming the words, and whatever came out, you had to do it. So the let's say, and it was an intent for us to see like what are the most cliche movements that are related to certain words, and they are still part of. And it was also a way of trying to make language violent, very direct.
What happens when you repeat that? When you work, I mean, as you always work in repetition, also when you do performances and you do it again and again, what happens with the cliches and because then you should repeat. You should not repeat. You should do it instantly.
Yeah. That went through a long process. When it was a duet, we tried to work with the specific rhythm or musicality that came out of it. And that was one of the things we practiced the most. So in terms of being kind of the instant. So we were trying to analyze specifically that as a intention. Then many years later, we did a solo. I should also say that there's a lot of parts in the duet that is not part of the solo, so they are also quite different. But now we are trying to work much more with almost considering each word as small scenes. Small scenes are like characters that gets interrupted or altered. So now we are working much more from an intentional point of view, so we kind of create a small universe around each movement in a way. That would also have, let's say, a possibility to fall out very long in time, but then gets shot, but that she constantly knows the direction of them. Yeah. So it has changed how we have been working with that material, but for sure, I mean, it's not possible to do the exact same thing.
I think I would like to add on to this. So we talked a little bit about it yesterday, and that has to do with I think the Lacanian real, in terms of collapsing, in terms of the physical body being there all the time, and at times facing the impossible, stuck in movement, trying to find a way to get out of that. And even if you repeat it, physicality is still there, impossibility is still dealt with, and then you try to shift that. But I think that's a dimension that you're playing with a lot, and that the real then is always present, even if you have shifted it into some beautiful moment of saying thank you. So it's still there. That's something that I kept, thinking about in terms of I know you haven't. You said you haven't read into sort of Lacanian theory, and I'm not sure you wish to do that. But that's a concept that deals specifically with tension between brute anxiety, physicality, impossibility, and something that's also very necessary. It's violent, but it's necessary as well. So it's a concept I thought that you might enjoy.
Yeah, for sure.
Eva and I have talked a bit about that in her previous, work with the mirror. Yeah, so you could say more about that. That's just something I thought, you could.
No, and I think also like when you repeat something, I mean, I think also we are of course very much aware of that we could never repeat anything anyhow exactly. So when
yes, it's impossible.
so it's already that impossibility, and that's anyhow just an illusion in a way. So I think what's interesting then is that how do we then develop practices, I mean quite specific practices for the performer to acknowledge the difference. Because I think sometimes if you are present with the difference making without feeling that you are, let's say, doing mistakes in relationship to the original, there's also a certain type of presence or real to be found in the sensing of the alteration.
Yeah, and that's the freedom that you have.
Right, and that's also where she is present in discovering or sensing the material anew. Right, so, and then what's interesting is then to say, so how do then the score relate to how she can then alter the thing that comes after in relationship to the thing that was altered now, and right, and then she's in this juggle, and then of course when the layers then a score like. Yesterday was kind of nice because there were many people coughing, and there's certain parts of the piece where she reacts on that. So she had also a lot of, and then if she's doing both things at the same time, it becomes very complex for her, even though she's so skilled, right? So we of course also, I mean, like everyone else, I guess, we change the performance constantly, slightly.
Foresight.
Yes. No, it's never the real. I mean, every time we go touring, I have changes. It's like Sophia always goes like, I wonder what changes you will do this time.
It just strikes me that is this a variation of the performance that we are doing now? Because it just strikes me that I've never been to a talk before where I haven't seen the performance. And we talk about the performance all the time, but I'm going to see the performance very soon. And it also, so I have certain expectations, and I have a direction already because I know in 1 hour I will already be seeing this performance. Right. And also, especially when you were talking about the performance, it's like a staging. You are sort of staging the performance in some way. And I just thought it was interesting to see this talk as a kind of a staging of this performance.
As a prologue to the prologue.
Yeah. So we'll see what we will experience now.
Can I've been sitting here, one thing I wanted to bring up before and that I forgot to say, and that I don't just want to leave out of the conversation, coming into being as a woman, and again, I think there's a very specific gender aspect to this performance as well, but she is referring back to Merleau-Ponty, and of course sort of the being in the flesh and so on. And I would have liked to have asked about it before when Petra was here, who had the baby, because she just wrote a dissertation she's been working on as an actor on Astrid, and she talks a lot about the body as situation in that work, and as a sort of an acting technique that she's been developing. So it'd be interesting to hear the two of you talk together. But as I've been sort of holding on to this idea, because it's something that struck me when I was watching yesterday, I'm now maybe revising that a little bit, because or it's making me think about how we think about situation and how we think about material somehow, right? It seems to me that in this conversation now, and this has just been happening in my head, but that normally, conventionally, we would think about the body as material. That just came back, like the body is always there, the physicality of the body that's doing different things. And that the situation would sort of be the context in which it gets interpreted. But I'm thinking that there's something here in this practice that actually is doing a reversal of that, where the ephemeral movement, the ephemerality of dance actually is the material that you keep referring back to.
Yes.
Whereas the body becomes the situation somehow. Like it's not that it's ceasing to be material, but that somehow what you're pointing to, it seems, is that there is no actual material without the sort of like the process of interpretation, creation, technique, adjustment, that whole thing that is really a temporal thing rather than a sort of a given fact, you know, is how you're using the body here.
Yeah.
You know? And I don't know if we can talk about a body outside or beyond or before the way that it gets put into use.
Right.
Right.
And
So I don't know, I mean, it's just a reflection. It's not really a question, but it's
because I think it's also
an interesting critical way of thinking, I think. Yeah.
Super interesting. Yeah. But I think it's also a matter of I don't know now many things. But that's maybe what in a way maybe what I wanted to address in the beginning when I talked about movement heritage or movement memory. At least I think it's really interesting to think of awareness or consciousness in relationship to the body, and then the materiality of the body not being one, right? I mean, or not being only a thing. No, so like every time you're doing a movement, no matter if it's a practice movement in a specific performance that has certain coordinations, you're also dealing with all of these inscriptions of other things that Sophie has with her as well, right? So there's anyhow the materiality that is at stake in any performance, if you would choose to attack it, is all of those materials or all of those inscriptions. At least, I mean, and I think also like because sometimes when we certain of these practices that comes on the score that we put on the material, and when I say material, it's let's say that's the decided choreography, right? It's maybe the quotation that we see as the material. But then these other things that are obstructing the material to be able to be realized, that is something that has also been practiced for a long time. So there's a lot of different type of techniques or methodologies connected to that. I mean, this is maybe not an answer really. I'm just trying.
It doesn't need to be. Yeah, go.
I'm thinking partly it connects to my question because I mean one way of thinking of context is that you have context and then you have action in that context. But I mean there will be people again as the methodologists that would say that no, you cannot separate. Context is produced through action. So I mean to uphold normality or deviation from normality is extremely hard work, and you're doing that to produce a certain context, and it's always on the verge of collapsing actually. So you're really struggling to uphold regularity.
Right.
So I don't know if
no, I think that plays into it definitely, and I mean to me it's interesting to think about also the amount of work, as you're saying, that goes into just doing regular things. And which comes back to the comment that walking is the hardest thing, right? There's so much work that goes into keeping the body upright, keeping it moving, and that we've internalized that so much that we don't think about it as work. We potentially think about it as material, like the given material of the body, but I think that I mean, in a way that's not just discursive or theoretical, but that's actually happening in action in front of the audience or together with the audience, that you're in a way analyzing that or staging it, articulating it, which is very fascinating.
And I think because there will be so much also resistance when you try to alter these type of things. I mean, there's a lot of different, I think, mental and physical resistance in trying to do these alterations of these normative choreographies that we have so heavily inscribed. That's also very hard labor. And I think also because, at least from my perspective, the body is lazy in that sense. It doesn't want to change. Now, so we need consciousness and discipline and techniques to change it, but it will always try to fall back into right? I mean, I think it's also, I mean, it's the same thing as bodies also copies each other. Like now I just realized that I also forgot that. No, but like these type of things. Also, I mean, there's so many like what is, then that's where I think the unconscious is an interesting thing to think of. Like because I would guess that because we can only be conscious about one specific maybe part of the movement at one time, all the other body parts will unconsciously be still copied. So when we are working to redirect and reconfiguring the normative of the neck movement, the legs has already practiced and repeated the walking several weeks already. So it's kind of like it's a hard end game. I mean, no, like I think the machinery, it's brutal.
Can I just add, when talking about walking, at something that is so ordinary as this floor, in the performance is something else. It's a different surface, and that is vibrant matter. Speaking about context, it's an active agent, and we rarely think about it, but it does affect us because it constructs the space in a specific way. It is built out of a material that would make us feel sort of all right in this environment. It could be something else that made us feel different. So I just wanted to add that because I think it's so. It's often very redundant, but it's hugely important. And also, the dancer in your performance, she has so much interaction with the floor.
A lot.
A lot. The noise and the sort of the things that are going on there. So just sonographic sort of addition to this sort of vibrant, contextual, embodied thing.
It's actually already 6 o'clock. 1 minute past. So unfortunately, the conversation is over. And hopefully, at least a few of you will have a chance now to go see the performance. Poor Sophie, if only she knew. But I want to say thank you so much to Björn, and thank you to Astrid, and thank you to all of you for coming and for engaging so much.
Thank you.
This is
thank you so much for
very,
arranging.
very, very inspiring, I think, talk and occasion. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I will run actually.
Yes. I'll be there before. You know your way out.
Yes. Men vi ses ju kanske inte.